Hello and welcome to this Fireside Chat of the Center on Regulation and Markets at the Brookings Institution. My name is Sanjay Patnaik and I'm the new director of the center. In our new series of Fireside Chats, we will explore important topics related to modern day markets and regulations through one-on-one conversations with regulators, business executives, and academics. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome Loni Mahanta, who is the Vice President of Policy Development and Research at Lyft. In her role, she drives comprehensive policy strategy and helps Lyft to understand the legal, regulatory, and policy landscapes the company is facing. She leads a team of experts in the areas of sustainability, safety, privacy, labor, and data analytics. Before formally joining the policy team, she spearheaded an industry-leading initiative called The Future of Work, which focused on innovations in labor policy, portable benefits, and worker protections for gig economy workers. She joined Lyft in the early days as part of the legal team, and she worked as a commercial litigator before that. She has an undergraduate degree from Stanford and a law degree from the University of California. Welcome, Loni, and thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to having a chance to talk through some interesting issues.
Great, thank you. So I thought in our Fireside Chat today, we can explore some of the regulatory landscape that Lyft is facing, and maybe we can start off just with a brief overview of the company and how the company has developed since its beginning, especially as the industry of ride-sharing has matured. Please.
So Lyft began in 2012. It's really only 8 years since the company that I think a lot of people are aware of and know by name first came onto the scene. We were the first company to establish peer-to-peer on-demand ride-sharing, and it really began as a way to unlock unused capacity in cars. And now it's become a way that millions of Americans get around. We have facilitated over 1 billion rides on the Lyft platform. Millions of people have used the platform to provide driving opportunities. Transportation really has been a way to kind of help connect people, get people around, get people to where they need to go, get people to their jobs, medical appointments, school. And, after our, initial days focused entirely on rideshare, we've expanded into micromobility as well, using rideshare, bike share, scooters, connecting with public transit to help people get around.
Great, thank you. This is very interesting. I would like to move a little bit into the regulatory space, right? Because I think one of the really interesting aspects of your industry, even from my own work, is that the laws and regulations governing passenger transport are largely the responsibility of local and state governments, right? And so to some degree, this is a reflection of different policy preferences across different localities. But at the same time, it also creates a patchwork of different rules that the company has to face. So I'm curious, in your experience, has this decentralized regulatory approach provided benefits for the company, or would you prefer, for instance, a federally kind of like centralized approach to regulating this industry?
I think of this as a both and question, and it really depends on the context. It depends on the regulatory outcome or goal that we're talking about for it to sort of make sense of whether or not there should be a completely federal approach or whether there are times when a local municipal approach is the right one. So you can look at autonomous vehicles as an area where a consistent federal standard, I think, is going to be critical to make sure that we don't have inconsistent or conflicting patchwork of state law, municipal regulation, safety standards, for instance. We want to have those be federalized so that manufacturers can be meeting a single standard to the best ability possible as we're navigating sort of the new world of AVs when we get there. On the state level, we operate ride sharing in 50 states, and more than 40 of those states have a single regulatory framework for rideshare. It makes a big difference from an operational perspective if that is at the state level or the city level. So in that regard, we really do prefer a state level approach, so that sort of everything within that jurisdiction can be standardized within that single state. But then there are issues where it really doesn't make sense to have a state or federal approach, things like curb space utilization. So we work with cities and urban planners We actually just announced a Resilient Streets initiative. We worked in San Francisco on with urban planners on creating a better Market Street to help curb traffic, to focus on curb and traffic management. Before COVID hit, we were working with the city of Boston to pilot and evaluate pickup drop-off zones on an area near Fenway Park. These are things that just like really wouldn't make any sense to be at a state or federal level. So I think it is one of these things that is dependent on the issue that we're discussing. I would also note, though, that for any other companies that are sort of thinking about how to approach some of these issues, it is a challenge for a company that moves quickly and kind of is in hyper growth to figure out how to navigate a lot of different laws all at the same time. Just from knowing what the law and regulatory schemes are, the structures are, and figuring out how to build your product around that, and having to do that very quickly. It's perhaps an issue that's unique to some startups that build quickly, but I think it is a challenge. It's something that has to be figured out.
That's actually, the last point is quite interesting because it's to some degree, these are very new business models and new industries like ride sharing, or even if we look at Airbnb in the broader sharing economy. So if you think about kind of like your experience as Lyft, what do you think can startups learn in how to engage with regulators to try to work together to create some of these regulatory frameworks, and actually think about how can we regulate some of those new markets with these new business models?
So I think at the top line, the most important thing is to know what exists now. So first, foremost, maybe this is an obvious statement, but companies that are sort of operating in a regulated space or an adjacent to regulated space, these startups need to know what exists currently and make sure that they're cognizant of those and being really thoughtful about where they fit into existing frameworks. Then they need to also be thinking about, are there places where the goals of those regulatory objectives could be achieved, but in a different way that still allows for the company to sort of move forward in the way that it wants to. So that requires dialogue with policymakers, helping policymakers understand what that entity, what your company is like trying to do, what you're trying to accomplish, and make sure you have a dialogue sort of back and forth about what the value of this company is and what the goal of those initial regulations are for. The third piece is then to talk about, are there changes that might need to be made? And sometimes the answer is going to be no. Sometimes the right policy answer there is no. These exist as they are and nothing should be changed. But that isn't always the case. And I would say that, when Lyft first started, that was exactly what we did. We're now regulated in most places as a transportation network company. But that definition did not exist in 2010. It was not there. It wasn't a thing that there was a term. It wasn't a regulated entity. And so it was really working with policymakers, which is something that Lyft did in its early days as part of our DNA of our first policy team, was to help policymakers understand what this idea of peer-to-peer rideshare was, that a recognition that it should be regulated, but it should be regulated in a way that allows for this sort of new model of transportation, which we now see 8 years later has resulted in a huge amount of transportation access and opportunity that did not exist before rideshare.
Okay, that's interesting. And how does Lyft kind of like approach these different levels, right? The federal, the state, and the local level. Do you have in your policy team, do you have people that work regionally, that focus on certain regions, or do you have people that kind of like do it centrally? I'm curious how you approach that.
So we've had different versions of how we've managed these things over the years. I would say in the early days of Lyft, so if you're a small startup and you don't have a lot of resources, you'll have one or two people that are doing everything. They're doing policy development. They are talking with policymakers at the city, state, and federal level all around the country. You'll probably be relying on a wide network of consultants to sort of help you know what's coming up, the conversations that are having to expand your networks. But then we have where we are at Lyft today, where we have a fairly substantial policy team. We have people that do policy development, and those are the sort of substantive experts that on my team. But then we also have people that are on the ground, kind of across the country, talking day to day with policymakers about the sort of breadth of what Lyft is, what we do, all the different policy issues and challenges and questions that you might have, from taxes to sustainability questions, and then on those places, and we have people in state capitals, people in DC working with Congress. So we sort of have a broad array.
Interesting. Okay. And so if you look at the landscape that Lyft has been facing, right, over the last couple of years in terms of regulation, what do you think the biggest regulatory challenges were that the company has faced in the US?
Well, it's sort of interesting here, because this is an area that has sort of changed over time. I would say, like I was mentioning, is like how we approach some of these issues in the first instance was, how do we operate at all? How do we exist? Because we were not a tech company that existed sort of in a virtual sense only. We touched lives and streets, and it impacted on a physical level. People were getting in each other's cars, and so we had to create a regulatory structure or work with policymakers to create a regulatory structure to exist at all. So that was sort of the first thing that we had to kind of get past, that first hurdle. And then I would say that what I think has been interesting is the transition to sort of seeing other policy issues that existed before, that people probably that were looking at the industry might have been able to call out, but they were not what were conceived of as the main policy issues of that initially, before we even knew in 8 short years where we would be, how much scale that we would be at. And so the things that I look at on that side are really like labor policy questions. When John and Logan, our co-founders, started this, it was really truly about utilizing empty seats in cars and how you can fill an underutilized asset. There was no inkling at that time that we would be sort of this central part of the conversation around the changing American workforce. That wasn't conceived of. And so that's okay, right? Like, nobody needs to, they have a responsibility, Lyft has a responsibility and obligation to recognize whatever those new challenges are and those new questions are. But it just wasn't what was, it's not what anybody knew was going to happen.
So it sounds like it's kind of a really dynamic space, right? Where you have to adapt always to very rapidly moving parts.
Yeah. And I think that's very much what I've seen. So when our kind of V1 of our policy team, there was no centralized focus on these labor policy issues. And that's about 2 years ago, I was working with John Zimmer on questions around worker issues. And this was before the change in the law from the California Supreme Court and the Dynamex decision came down, and before AB 5. We were just talking about what is Lyft's role and responsibility in this conversation around worker benefits tied to employment. What does it mean if drivers are independent contractors? What does it mean if this McKinsey report that says some 40 million workers are doing some type of independent work, and we have a social safety net tied to W-2 employment? What is our role in that? So we started working on that before a lot of things changed in the legal space. And I pitched John and Logan. I said, I think that we need to have a centralized focus on these issues. I think there's a lot of issues. We ended up calling it future of work, which I don't know, is perhaps a bit of a overbroad, or I don't know if I love the term, frankly, but the point was that there was a bunch of different issues that kind of all fall within this labor policy space, from worker classifications to cities asking questions about minimum earnings, to worker voice and what that means in sort of this changing workforce, all the way down to worker displacement due to automation. So pitch them on that we needed to think about these things holistically. And that was sort of my first foray into the policy world, like formally. So I do think your point is well taken, that there is a lot of dynamism and a lot of change that happens very rapidly.
Okay. And so the next question is a bit more on the academic level, but I'm curious. So as we know, usually regulators, when they introduce regulations, they try to address some kind of underlying market failure, right? So this is the public interest theory. Market failures for our audience are market power, for instance, or information asymmetries, etc. So if you kind of like what do you think, if you look at what regulators have done, what kind of market failures do you think regulators are trying to address when they regulate the ride-sharing industry?
Okay. So first, let me push back a little bit on whether or not that's like the right, if that theory or if that view kind of encompasses a lot of like of the breadth of what we see on the other side of things. Mm-hmm. So, you know, if you look at public interest theory, how do you determine what's in the public interest? What are the policymakers looking at? What I think has been an interesting development for me as I work with policymakers at city, state, and federal levels, and different policymakers even within the same state, is that a limited subset of policymakers are looking at the whole, are looking at sort of the breadth of all of the different policy implications of a company like Lyft. And instead, most policymakers that we come across look at a subset, right? So you'll have an air resources board that's rightly looking at carbon emissions and regulating carbon emissions, but they might not care all that much about transportation access and the important role that that plays in sort of a overarching city or a municipal system, right? Mm-hmm. That same board might not be looking at what it meant for communities of colors when they had to rely on taxis that would, you know, disproportionately not serve those communities, and that rideshare was a huge boon on transportation access. Likewise, you could have taxing agencies at the city level, perhaps, that, or maybe you look at it at the state level, a state taxing authority that is, their mandate is to look at taxes and sort of if appropriate taxes are being paid, fine, makes sense. Yeah. They're not going to be looking at what the municipal taxing system is. They're looking at a state, not a city level. But these incremental taxes that add up over time, and every additional increase in single cent has an impact on the cost to passengers who are cost sensitive, and you know exactly what the price elasticity is for the demand for those passengers is variable. And are they who's looking at the whole of what each one of those tax increase looks like and what that means for transportation access? So I think it's just been an interesting thing for me, is that I think that there is a huge part of what regulators that are doing that are looking at market failures, but also there's not that many policymakers whose mandate is to sort of look at the whole.
Okay, so you're saying there's maybe not enough interaction among different parts of regulators that look at different aspects of a business.
Yeah.
Okay, and what kind of, earlier to my earlier question, what kind of market failures do you think they're trying to kind of like regulate?
I think the things that we are seeing now are questions that, and the big areas that I would see are questions around congestion, what that means for cities, valid questions around carbon emissions, because there are vehicles on the road, and that of course contributes to carbon emissions and climate change. So like, I think those are real questions. Of course, there's questions around worker classification, and there's questions around earnings and earning standards. Safety is another one that's sort of like, how do you figure out what the right way to kind of approach some of these things are? And a lot of that I think does make sense, right? Like, we, of course, think we're trying to do the right thing. Lots of people can disagree with that, but we think that we're trying to do the right thing. But that's not enough, right? There actually needs to be a regulatory scheme to ensure that all players are acting by the same standards and by the standards that are necessary. Like, so that, you know, that I think is uncontroversial. But those are, I think, the substantive areas that we see a lot of focus on.
Sense. Yeah, and I think it's important, right? Like with the interplay of markets and regulations, that you have to have that overarching framework that levels the playing field, right?
Exactly.
A flip side of this, and this actually is related to some of my own work, is that you have regulations to correct market failures, but then sometimes as regulators or policymakers, you have to be careful not to kind of like impede innovation, right? Because some of these regulations might have the potential to impede innovations if you over-regulate or you go too far into one direction. So my question is kind of like, if you had to select one regulation you have faced in the US, which one do you think has been most detrimental to innovation in the industry? Probably a very difficult question to ask.
I know. Let me think about this a little bit. I don't know if I have a great answer. So let me start a little bit with, I might have to come back to you on sort of a good example of this. I mean, I think for Lyft and for any company that's facing this, I think it's critical to make sure you understand what those goals of the regulations are, and then work with policymakers to ensure that there are not sort of unnecessary regulations that are sort of layered in. So one of the things that we saw were some old taxi rules that perhaps didn't achieve anything, and were sort of hindering new companies to sort of come in, or new industries that were sort of in the transportation space. And sometimes you sort of see residual regulation that doesn't seem to effectuate. It's hard to know what the goal, hard to know if the value of that is really worthwhile. So one of the things that I think about was there were, I think, 2 cities at one point that had mandates of having fire extinguishers in the car. Okay. And I'm surely that was a safety regulation, but is it really a necessary safety regulation given to this, you know, is a fire extinguisher really necessary? And you might think it doesn't really matter, but it did matter a lot if that was going to be a rule for peer-to-peer rideshare, because as you're helping people get on the road and you know, go through safety checks and sort of get whatever license, if that city requires a license, to actually also require that people get a perhaps unnecessary fire extinguisher makes it quite difficult to like get people out on the road. So, I mean, that's sort of a very small example, but it's one of those things where you wouldn't know that that is a hindrance to getting up to scale until you're in the process of operationalizing and implementing some of the rules.
Oh, that's interesting. So these are some of the kind of like maybe remnant regulations, right? That fit to an older business model and they had a purpose, but now with the newer ones, it might not apply. I think that's interesting. I think it shows kind of like a little bit that dynamic interplay, right? Because you have these markets and industries moving and evolving very rapidly. And then it's sometimes difficult, I think, for policymakers to really keep up with that. And so to find that sweet spot is a challenge, I think. Maybe we can move to a more specific example now. So you had mentioned before earlier, congestion, right? It is one of the issues that regulators are trying to address. And so New York has been actually implementing some of those regulations in that area. So they put a limit on the number of ride-sharing drivers and cars within the city limits in Manhattan. And so I'm curious, how do you think that that regulation has affected Lyft, and what have been the implications for Lyft riders and drivers at the same time?
So, you know, there are a couple different regulations that all went in at the same time in New York. And what was interesting is that we think that those regulations, you know, negatively impacted the sort of the whole user population, from passengers to drivers, in ways that were not intended. So in order to sort of meet the regulations as they were drafted, we had to restrict access to the platform in order to comply with the city rules and still have a business that we could operate within the city limits, which resulted in over 10,000 drivers sort of losing some of access to the platform in the ways that they were used to. And I think what's been interesting as sort of on congestion is that we're a vocal proponent of universal congestion pricing. And so but we think that universality is a critical component to any congestion regulation actually achieving the goals of what the stated goal is. So, so we view that. So we would address all components, right? So it would not be a congestion tax simply on rideshare. It's all of the different ways in which people are driving on the road: delivery trucks, personal vehicles, commuters. Like, if you're going to be trying to impact congestion, you need to be sort of looking at the whole ecosystem. Okay. And actually, interestingly, my research team just flagged for me that there was a Brookings paper just this month that specifically called out, let me see here, I had a great little note here. Let's see. Yeah, so I was saying that on congestion, exactly this, that the efficient policy is not to limit Uber and Lyft operations, but for policymakers to set an efficient congestion toll and emission charges on all vehicles. That's the sort of appropriate way to actually impact what happens in congestion. what ends up happening, and this is sort of the interplay of like good policy and politics. They're not the same thing, right? The political avenue, the political viability of imposing congestion taxes beyond rideshare is much, much more difficult than it is to put on rideshare. So, okay, you're gonna perhaps tax a part of the equation like rideshare, but are you actually going to have the impact on congestion that you want?
So you're thinking kind of like really to limit or kind of like try to limit access for a wide range of different vehicles and drivers to kind of like reduce the congestion. Okay, that's interesting. I think some cities in Europe have tried that approach.
That's exactly
I think
right.
Paris was one of those, right? That are trying to really reduce the traffic there. So do you have internal studies? I'm curious, kind of like looking at what the impact of ride sharing has been on levels of congestion in urban areas. Has it increased? Has it contributed to it? I'm curious if you guys have looked at that.
So we don't have comprehensive, or at least I'm not aware of, sort of comprehensive studies on exactly what this looks like. This is something that really has to be done in partnership with other with cities as well, because we don't have access to. We have access to a huge amount of data, but it's a limited subset of data, right? Like it's not. It doesn't tell you the full story of who's on the streets at what times and what that means. We all have our own anecdotal experiences of being in a crowded city and seeing perhaps a Lyft or Uber sticker on a car. And so I think maybe we have our own visceral reaction to what's out there, but I think even our data is going to be somewhat limited because we don't have access to the full scope of all the different cars that are driving on a road at any specific moment in time.
So it's hard to assess from one company's perspective what the impact has been. You would have to look at the total picture. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me move a little bit kind of like away to another coast, another regulatory issue, right? So you have faced some challenges in California with the AB5 bill, which uses the so-called ABC test to determine whether worker is an independent contractor or not, right? And so there is ambiguity about whether Lyft or Uber drivers would qualify as employees under this test, and we have had a couple of court decisions now also resulting in multiple companies, including Lyft, Uber, and DoorDash, putting a ballot initiative to a vote during the elections. And so the question is, if your drivers end up qualifying as employees, what would be the outcome, kind of like, and the impact on your business model, on riders and drivers in California?
Yeah. Okay, so this is like a big meaty topic. And so we'll just kind of, ask me questions as we're kind of going through this. So first of all, I would say that I'm cautiously optimistic that the ballot proposition will go through and that we will be able to sort of maintain the flexibility that is the reason why we know so many drivers utilize Lyft in the first place. And we can talk a little bit more about what's in that, if that's of interest to you. But what I think is like important here to understand is that for many years, we've been advocating for a path to enshrine this flexibility while continuing to add more protections and benefits on top of that flexibility. But, if we have to change models, if there is something that's fundamentally different, it would really require a radical restructuring of the business. And this is something that is not, it's sometimes misconstrued, right? The question sometimes comes up, well, there's nothing in employment law that prohibits flexibility. And that's true. That is a true statement. It's not about a prohibition. It's about the way any company could be actually implementing an employment model with the on-demand or actually on-supply model that currently exists. And I say on-supply because it's not about, on-demand is about when a passenger has access to rideshare.
Yeah.
On supply, perhaps, is when a driver has access to those work opportunities. That is what would be different under an employment model. And here I think it's really important to note that flexibility is also a term that gets misused a little bit. I was actually talking with somebody in my town recently, and he said, I don't understand. I can pick my shifts next week at work. Isn't that a flexible model? I said, good question. So what that is, though, that is the ability to pick your shift. I said, but if you don't show up for your shift next week, are you going to get fired? He said, yes, I will get fired. I'm like, that is the difference, right? It's about being able to choose in real time with no consequences about whether or not you're going to work in that moment. And that is like a critical distinction about what we mean by complete real-time flexibility. Okay, so why am I even talking about that? Because that's the thing that would fundamentally be different under an employment model. So just consider this one issue. When drivers are logged into Lyft, they're currently under no obligation to pick up a passenger or to do anything in that period, right? In fact, they can be in an Uber ride or a DoorDash delivery or whatever during that time period.
But they can be logged in and available in case they want to take something, but they don't have to commit to doing anything. Okay.
Exactly. So you have your app on, you're under no obligation to do anything. If a ride request come in, you can take it or you can ignore it and just go about doing whatever else you're doing. Now, in the employment world, people on the other side of this debate, plaintiffs' lawyers or whoever's on the other side, they say that as soon as you turn on the app, well, now you're working. If you're an employee, you're now working and you have to be paid as soon as the app is open. But if that's the case, if you have to be paid as soon as the app is open, then we can no longer allow drivers to be switching between apps, be declining rides, because you can't pay people while they're working for some other company or while they're not doing their work. If the system stays the same and the opponents have their way, people start getting paid as soon as the Lyft app is open. That makes this app an ATM app. You're under no obligation to do anything, but you get paid as soon as you turn the app on. It can't be that you have no obligation to work and you get paid as soon as the app is turned on. So stated another way, under an employment model, it doesn't make sense for us to pay drivers to have the app turn on, but not be providing any rides. So we'd have to move to a more traditional world of employment that everybody actually intuitively understands, which is you have to show up for work, you have to do the work when it's assigned, and that's going to look a whole lot more like employment like everybody else has already seen it, hourly work with some type of shifts. Maybe it won't be full day shifts, maybe it'll be some other type of shift work, but there's going to be an obligation to do the work. There's going to be times when you have to work. That's what comes with an employment model.
Okay, so you would treat them kind of like they would be employees, and then if they show up, if they turn on the app, that means they would have to take any ride that gets assigned to them immediately, maybe by the app or and then finish their shift, and then they're done, and then they can go home.
Yeah, and so I think that's what's critical about understanding what this distinction is between the flexible work model and an employment model. And again, this conversation gets really misconstrued because the question becomes, well, nothing in employment law requires this. It's not about an affirmative requirement. It's about how any company could continue to operate a model where you turn on the app and get paid but have no obligation to do anything. That just can't work. I think that's common sense statement. I don't think that's sort of disingenuous or trying to be hiding the ball here. It's just that that model can't work.
So how would that affect your business model if you had to switch to such a model, right? And let's say you have to have these certain shifts, and then when they turn it on, they have to work a certain stretch for the company. What would be the impact be on drivers, on riders, and on your business model, kind of in terms of pricing, for instance? Would be curious to know.
So I'll caveat that by saying I don't know exactly. I can't tell you with certainty exactly how this would play out because it's a totally different business model. That's the thing that I think is really critical to understand. There is a world where you could conceive of that business model, but it is not the one that we have 8 years of experience running. So all of this is hypothetical, and I really don't know with certainty. But the things that we would anticipate happening are that, one, you'd have a reduced service area, especially in suburban and rural areas. So if you have questions or concerns about transportation access, I suspect that there is going to be an impact on sort of the breadth of service levels. There's also going to be almost certainly like a price increase. And so, that will of course also have impact on the sort of the size of who can access it, how many, who is going to be priced out once there's a price increase. Another kind of small, but I think interesting note here is that instant access to earnings immediately after a driver finishes a ride, that would likely be eliminated. So what we've seen, I'll just digress here for a moment, well, we first pioneered Express Pay. That was the ability to sort of push and get, get the funds, the amounts earned within 24 hours. That was a pretty big revolutionary change for drivers. It was like instant access to nearly instant access to earnings. Then I think about maybe a year and a half ago, we implemented instant pay. And so that's as soon as you finish a ride, that money is in your bank account right away.
Okay.
But there is like very little chance, given the regulatory framework, especially in a place like California, where there's very strict and regimented rules around pay statements, all for valid, understandable reasons. But the likelihood that we could do express pay and still meet those requirements is unlikely to be the case, at least for some period of time. Again, I don't know exactly how this plays out, but instant earnings and a biweekly paycheck and meeting pay statement requirements, those things are probably not going to coexist with each other.
Okay, so that would really be kind of like more shifting to a much more traditional model, maybe like a taxi company or something like that, facilitated by technology. Okay, and so I'm curious, like if you take the alternative viewpoint, right? Like what people on the other side are saying, like they're saying, okay, these people are driving for Lyft and Uber, and they don't have benefits, they work as drivers, kind of like. How would you address some of their concerns if you don't classify them as employees but independent contractors, and still be able to kind of address some of the concerns they do have?
Well, I mean, I think that's what Proposition 22 was meant to accomplish, right? So first, and I think critically, it enshrines the sort of flexible work model. It doesn't allow for some other, I don't think Lyft would ever do this, but some other bad actor company to say, great, we have all these things and now we're also going to impose shifts because we feel like it. So the flexible work model is enshrined. But then, adding other things on top of that, like a guaranteed minimum earnings, a new healthcare benefit, medical and disability coverage, occupational accident insurance, enshrining protections against discrimination and sexual harassment. So that's one approach. I would think, though, that this is a conversation that continues one way or the other, and one that we anticipate having dialogue and would hope to have dialogue with policymakers on, right? This is not something that we do on our own. This has to be done in conjunction with other interested stakeholders, actually, frankly, including labor, community organizations, and policymakers, the legislative and executive level.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of stakeholders, even across industries. It's not only within the ride-sharing industry, right? And so in your view, do you think that other states will move forward with similar reforms or similar initiatives like California has so far? And if not, do you think there should be kind of like a reform, maybe even at the federal level, kind of like focusing on these issues? Because as you say, they will pop up across the country. They pop up in different industries that are part of the sharing economy. And so I'm curious to see what you're thinking in that regard.
So first, I would note that national polling indicates that drivers and people that are independent workers prefer, the 71% of individuals prefer the freedom of being an independent contractor. And 82% say that they would prefer to be an independent contractor to an employee. A recent survey of California drivers said that preferred independent contractor status 6-1. So one, there is like a desire of the individuals who are doing this work. Now, that doesn't answer the whole policy question, and I'm very well aware of that. That is only one piece of this. But what I think is important to note there is that the ways in which people are working and what employment provides for people, very valid things that the employment structure provides, consistent stability, dignity to work, those are all things that are valid and understandable. But people are choosing to do other types of work, finding multiple income streams. And there's a spectrum of that work, of people that are building out their own lives intentionally with multiple income streams, that I think belies the way in which our labor and employment laws are currently structured. There are still, like I said, valid questions about making sure that we're protecting vulnerable people, that we're not allowing companies to sort of undercut baseline standards, regardless of what an individual says that they want. That's all understandable. But I think that there is a shift happening in how people are working that policymakers need to be cognizant of if they want to create laws that sort of meet where people are today. Okay, so why am I talking about all of that? I say that because I don't think that what happened in California with this California Supreme Court sort of effectively changing the law. They said that they weren't, but in my humble opinion, they were changing the law with the Dynamex decision and the standard for who is an employee. And then AB 5 sort of passing the legislature and moving forward. That was not a panacea. And you don't really have to look any further than seeing that over 100 industries were exempted from this ABC test via the AB 5 process, without really rhyme or reason. There is not a consistent thread. If you look at these industries, you can't say, oh, these are just high earners, or these are just people with multiple clients. It's truly not that clear and simple. So it's not easy to say you can just put this on. So when you look at those two things, that there are a lot of people who are changing the ways in which they work, and that just flat imposition of the ABC test was problematic, and you need to look no further than the number of exemptions in industries that were exempted. I think states moving forward are going to see that there is something else that we need to be thinking about here, a different model that doesn't have to just be independent contractor. It can be independent contractor with other protections and benefits layered on top of that. And by the way,
maybe. Okay.
Yeah. And so, like, by the way, I would say that, like, we did not seek an exemption. That's never what we were trying to do. We were not just trying to go back to the old law, like those other 100 industries that were exempted. We were always trying to sort of create like a different path of what's the right balance of sort of independence, flexibility, and protections.
That's interesting. Okay, great. So maybe we can move a little bit to another topic, which I'd love to talk about, which is data and privacy, right? And so I think this is on the mind of a lot of consumers nowadays with potential data security, things like that. And so both drivers and riders have to share critical information with Lyft, right? Location, contact, payments, etc., when they use your services. And so I'm curious, how does the company decide how to share, with whom to share that data with? And what steps are you taking to ensure privacy?
Yeah. So as you know, our business model does, rely on having a fair amount of sensitive and important information from individuals to get riders to get from point A to point B. And it's really important for us to have that information to operate. But because this information is sensitive and matters deeply, we take a huge amount of care to ensure that we're not, that we're handling that appropriately. So first, I would say that one of importance in this conversation is that we don't sell user data, which is the crux of a lot of privacy legislation. So that's not something that we're like particularly implicated on that piece of things. And nonetheless, we do work to build privacy into Lyft at every level of our business. Investing heavily in privacy teams, technology, policies to keep sensitive information and PII secure. We're happy to see progress on some of these at the legislative level, like CCPA. But we also think that user data should be protected in every state that they live in. And so actually in this context, we support a strong federal privacy law. And I know that Brookings has been doing a fair amount of work on that piece as well. I think one thing that's sort of interesting to note, and perhaps something specific to Lyft or the rideshare world, is how to support cities and academics that are trying to understand mobility trends while still safeguarding user data. So a growing number of regulators want to require that we share extremely granular trip data with governments, often in real time. And it's something that we regularly push back on because of the implications for user privacy. And we recently saw an example of this in Seattle, where the city wanted data to inform their minimum wage ordinance, a fine and appropriate regulatory concern. But we could only ended up providing top level data to the city because it couldn't commit, or wouldn't, I'm not exactly sure what happened, but couldn't commit to protecting the confidentiality of driver and Lyft business data through appropriate information and security safeguards. And it just, I don't know if it wasn't able to, if there was like a technical side, if there were requirements, public disclosure requirements that were required once the city had any data. So there's sort of an intersection of like different policy objectives, but have real world impact for privacy and privacy of user data.
Mm-hmm.
So in that specific instance, what we did instead was provide our data to Cornell University, which was able to securely house the data. And it's first of its kind study actually analyzing what drivers across multiple platforms were earning.
Okay.
But so, I think the note there though is that Cornell could ensure technically and sort of from requests disclosure of private information.
So that would be kind of like they probably anonymize the data, make sure that you cannot trace back who's going where with the trips, and then they can provide the aggregate information to the government.
Exactly. And so we've seen this actually in other cities as well on sort of the micromobility side, which is like real-time, extremely granular user data that's not actually that the city themselves actually doesn't even have the ability to utilize that information on their own, and they work with a third party. And that third party, whether or not they have adequate safety security protocols, they're not necessarily going to be on the same heightened appropriate public scrutiny that Lyft is for ensuring that we're taking care of our user data. We give it to some other third party who knows what they're going to do with it, and they're under almost no obligation to do anything or not do anything with it. So it's sort of one of these interesting intersections of working with policymakers and privacy.
Yeah, and that really sounds like an area where federal privacy law, similar to what the EU has been doing, might actually be a really good approach, right? Because it would apply to these third parties, it would apply to everyone, and they have to really safeguard the data. Because even as you say, even if they don't pass on the data through the agreements, but they might be hacked or something like that, right? We have seen a lot of data breaches very recently. Oh, that's interesting.
Exactly.
Another last point I wanted to touch upon a little bit is kind of like safety, right? And so safety is perceived as a concern in your industry. And Lyft has taken some steps to enhance safety. You also have a safety advisory council. So I'm curious, how does Lyft think about safety more broadly? And do you think, and what kind of role do you think private and public partnerships could play for the entire industry in terms of safety?
Well, safety is fundamental to Lyft, and it's why we've invested in products and policies to protect riders and drivers. I mean, it is a real thing, and it is critical to all of us. Where you've gotten in a Lyft or Uber before, you know that, your own physical safety is something that you're thinking deeply about, and so are we. And look, safety is never done, right? It's something that it's like a continuum. It's something that you have to keep working on over time. But we have, last year alone, we launched more than 15 new safety features, including daily continuous criminal monitoring, in-app emergency assistance, mandatory feedback for any ride rated 4 stars or less. We formed a community safety program steering committee. We've partnered with herein, the nation's largest anti-sexual violence org, to roll out sexual violence prevention education to drivers. There are other safety features too, like in-app photos of driver and vehicle with increased license plate visibility, real-time ride tracking, digital receipts, two-way rating system. So I say all that because there's a lot of work that we have done, and it's like always been a primary focus for us. I think another interesting adjunct to the safety question is road safety, which we don't always include in this, but NHTSA reports that drunk driving crashes claim more than like 10,000 lives per year, and that rideshare services are a responsible alternative to driving impaired. And there's been a shift. Like I think in some cities we've seen really significant. Sioux Falls reported the lowest drunk driving arrests in more than a decade after Lyft's first full year of operation there. Miami-Dade reported in 2018 that DUI arrests were down 65%, in part because of ride sharing. So I think there's sort of like a holistic, broad view of like what safety is. And it's one that I think we do have to continue working with policymakers on. I think that there is sort of a role for public-private partnership. And I think it really is important to make sure that we're being thoughtful about what goals we're trying to achieve. An interesting example I would say there is, if you want to ensure that people are getting into the right car, right? Yeah. You don't want somebody getting into something that's not a Lyft. Well, what's the most important thing to do? It's to look at to start creating practices and habits where you look at the license plate before you get in the car. I know that I do that, but I don't know if everybody else does that. So like, let's start having mechanisms by which we start helping people ensure that they do that before getting into a ride. So, there have been steps that we're making along the ways there, like including like increasing the size of the driver's license when you see who your driver is that's coming.
That's interesting.
And so it's sort of these like little things, but when you're talking with policymakers, you need to make sure that we're all actually trying to, while the top line goal is shared, that the mechanisms for implementing that we're all sort of operating from that same playbook.
Yeah, and I think this is an area where you have really kind of like that interaction of regulation and markets again, because you have some of those like the mechanisms that actually might work through the app, and then you might have the overall regulatory framework that can help with that.
Yeah, and I think that's another interesting point there, is that you also want policymakers that are trying to address what happens right now, but how do you also build into the regulatory framework whatever that next technology is going to be, the different iteration of this specific thing 5 years from now?
Yeah.
What are the safety implications that are some overlap between ride share it as we know it today versus ride share when we have wide scale autonomous vehicles? Do we need to start thinking about some of the safety implications of that regulatory framework now and allow for it later? Do we acknowledge that, okay, let's just do what we have in front of us and then we'll have to change as things change later? So how do you build in enough ability and recognition that technology is going to change and address what we're seeing today?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially the autonomous vehicles is going to be really interesting, because you again have these different regulatory challenges, and that will affect both the business model and kind of like how companies operate in that space.
Yeah.
I'd like to start with just one final question, which is kind of like on the coronavirus, right? I mean, the entire economy, our industries have been affected by it, our personal lives, all of us. And so I'm curious, kind of like, can you speak a little bit about how Lyft has dealt with the pandemic and with the impact on its riders and drivers? And what do you see as kind of like the new normal going forward? Because as it looks now, the crisis is probably going to go on for quite some time. And kind of like, what is your path forward as a company in that crisis?
No surprise, this has impacted our industry significantly. Like any other part of the travel and tourism industry, COVID has had a great impact on Lyft as a company, but also on drivers and passengers. And so, we focused, when everything was like really kicking off, we had to just like pull together a company to try to understand what nobody could really make sense of. We were all kind of trying to figure it out at the same time and navigate, really small things, but like required a bunch of like quick internal movement of a city locking down all of a sudden overnight. How do we make sure that the right teams know what's happening in that city to like shut down operations if there was a curfew or a restriction on travel, and making sure that we're not doing anything to make sure that people are complying with the regulations that are being set in place. So those are kind of small implementation things. But from day one, we were working with and taking guidance from the CDC and local health officials to try to make sure that our health and safety policies are in accordance with that guidance. And so that led to a launch of our health safety program. So before riding or driving with Lyft, users must agree to our health safety commitment, or they'll be unable to request a ride or to drive with Lyft. There also is driver and rider education, as well as continued distribution of masks, cleaning supplies, and in-vehicle partitions to drivers. As always, drivers or riders can cancel rides at any time for safety reasons. But in this context, if somebody's not wearing a mask, you can cancel. A driver, for instance, could cancel if a passenger refuses to wear a mask, without penalty. And if a user repeatedly violates Lyft's health safety commitment, their account can be subject to suspension. So, I think that like we're gonna be a part of this ongoing conversation about how you keep people safe. And then there will be, I think another component of this that's been really interesting is that in the COVID world, the use of our multimodal systems like Lyft, bikes, and scooters has increased significantly because people perhaps are not riding in cars as much, but they are, still taking scooters and bikes to get around the cities. And, even that's a critical piece of just the overall transportation ecosystem. So again, like partnering with public transit agencies, you know, for first mile, last mile. And so, you know, we will be a part of like when we can get public transit back up and running, we'll be a part of helping get people to those systems. So I think it's like, I don't have any fulsome answers on exactly what happens here, because I don't think any of us do. You know, we're sort of all figuring out what happens in this COVID world together. But I do think that we're taking the steps that we need to be sort of part of the solution and making sure that we're kind of helping society move forward.
Great. Well, this has been really wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a pleasure to talk to you and hearing about all your thoughts and insights. Thank you.
Thank you. It was wonderful, wonderful to chat.
And all the best to California. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.